3 years after Western governments launched their most ambitious sanctions campaign in decades, one central question continues to surface. Are Russian sanctions working? On paper, the scale is impressive. Thousands of individuals and entities have been blacklisted, entire sectors of the Russian economy restricted, and trade channels reshaped by regulatory barriers. Yet despite the volume of measures announced, the impact of sanctions on Russia has been uneven at best, undermined by a fundamental design flaw in UK and EU sanctions policy. Rather than applying precise pressure on the levers of state power, many of these sanctions operate through blanket targeting that sweeps up individuals with minimal culpability. The result is a system that too often punishes peripheral figures, while leaving the underlying structures it seeks to disrupt largely intact. The EU and UK have presented their sanctions regimes as bold acts of deterrence. In practice, however, they function more like Dragnet operations. Lists of designated individuals grow longer each month, often based on tenuous associations rather than demonstrable wrongdoing. A photograph from a decade ago, a long dormant business tie, or the appearance of proximity to influence can be enough to justify punitive measures. Since 2022, more than 55 law firms have reported breaches of UK sanctions rules. These are not cases of deliberate evasion, but examples of how convoluted compliance has become. Ordinary firms find themselves caught in regulatory webs so complex that even seasoned institutions cannot reliably navigate them. Instead of tightening the noose on the Kremlin, these measures ensnare figures far removed from Russia's strategic core. Part of the reason lies in how governments measure success. Sanctions, once conceived as a surgical tool of foreign policy, have become a form of political theater. Each announcement of new EU sanctions on Russia is framed for headlines, emphasizing the growing number of people and companies added to the lists. The spectacle suggests progress, yet it rarely demonstrates tangible results. The logic of more is better creates incentives to prioritize symbolic gestures over substantive outcomes. It is easier for governments to showcase names frozen out of financial markets than to prove that these restrictions have altered Moscow's calculations. In this way, sanctions become a performance of strength rather than a strategy of effectiveness. The reliance on guilt by association compounds the problem. In the UK, Supreme Court's recent decision in Shvidler v. Secretary of State, British citizen Eugene Shvidler saw his assets frozen worldwide. Not because of unlawful activity, but because of his association with Roman Abramovich. Lord Leggett, in a blistering dissent, warned that the case rested on flimsy reasons and armchair theories. Shvidler had no political influence in Russia and no resources that could strengthen its war effort, yet his life was upended in service of what officials admitted was largely a public signal of resolve. The judgment illustrates how Russian sanctions often conflate association with culpability, sacrificing fairness for visibility. The Shvidler case is emblematic of a wider dysfunction. A sanction system that prizes optics over precision cannot hope to achieve its objectives. Consider Herbert Smith Freehills, a global law firm fined £465,000 for technical breaches. The penalty did not reflect a deliberate attempt to circumvent rules, but rather the sheer impossibility of navigating them flawlessly. The case points to a troubling trend: the criminalization of compliance failures in an environment where mistakes are inevitable. The problem is compounded by retroactive liability. John Ormerod, a 74-year-old finance veteran, was accused of facilitating Russian oil transactions that were entirely legal at the time they were undertaken. His situation exemplifies how sanctions frameworks morph from deterrence into retroactive punishment, leaving individuals exposed to devastating consequences for good faith business decisions. Taken together, these cases reveal the systemic weaknesses of international sanctions as they are currently applied. Policymakers highlight long lists of sanctioned individuals as evidence of action, but such lists are poor indicators of success. The reality is that the impact of sanctions on Russia has not lived up to their billing. While they have undoubtedly created disruption, their scattershot nature has undermined legitimacy and credibility. Instead of weakening the Kremlin, they risk weakening confidence in sanctions themselves as a viable policy tool. For sanctions to matter, they must evolve from performance to precision. That means abandoning Dragnet tactics in favor of evidence-based designations rooted in demonstrable culpability. It means ensuring that enforcement punishes misconduct, not mistakes, and that sanctions target the economic and political engines sustaining Russia's war rather than the peripheral figures who happen to orbit them. Until such reforms take hold, the question, are Russian sanctions working, will continue to haunt policymakers. The uncomfortable truth is that, as currently designed, the answer leans toward no. Sanctions have become a theater of toughness, a signal of resolve. But without sharper focus and credible application, they will remain more symbol than solution.